All right, I got the top of the hour. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Database Security Office Hours for January 2019. Our topic this month is going to be privilege analysis. If you've been following any of the more popular Oracle database security blogs, you're probably already aware that we recently made this feature available for anyone using the Enterprise Edition, and that's at no additional cost. This used to be something that was part of Database Vault, and it's important enough that we think everyone should be using it, so we have moved it into the core Enterprise Edition license. Privilege analysis is a valuable tool. You'll find that you can use it to assess your database users, and that it can play a huge part in reducing the attack surface for your database. Just a reminder, the call is recorded, and that recordings for this and previous AskTOM sessions are all available on the AskTOM website. Just click the All Sessions link to view the previous month's recordings. Office hours are intended to give you a direct line into your database security product development team. We start each office hour session with a presentation on some technical topic. Today that's going to be privilege analysis, and then we'll finish it up with an open line for any questions you may have. Feel free at any time to go ahead and enter questions into chat, and we'll get to those during the Q&A segment. Just a couple of quick announcements. The first one is you can look forward to database 19C, and that is coming before spring in the cloud. So sometime fairly quickly this month, next month, you'll see the cloud release of 19C, and the on-premises general availability will be a few months after that. 19C is a long-term release. That means that the plan is to support it through 2026. We expect most people will be moving off of 11.2, 12.1, 12.2, 18.1 to 19C fairly quickly. Also within the next couple of months, we've got a few other things coming out. Bundle Patch 10, for those of you using Audit Vault and Database Firewall, is coming out. That one's going to add in support for Linux 7.4 and 7.5. It's also going to add in SQL Server 2017 support. We're also releasing Key Vault 18.1, which is a significant release, and we hope to have an entire AskTOM session on this next month, talking about the new things that are in Key Vault 18.1. This month, within the next few weeks, you can look forward to seeing the Database Security Assessment Tool release version 2.1. And there's a lot of new stuff in this version of DBSAT. One of those is we've added in DISA STIG checking to our rules engine. This isn't intended to take the place of a STIG compliance checker. We're not going to go run through the entire STIG for you. But if you are using the Secure Technical Implementation Guides, what DBSAT will now do is if it finds something and whatever it finds is applicable to the STIGs, it will highlight that in its reports. We've got some new findings built into the rules checks, looking at how you're managing your password file, global names, backups, a lot more than that. We've made it a little bit easier to identify directly granted system privileges. I think if you look at the stuff that Rich is going to take you through in a few minutes as we go through privilege analysis, and you think about why it might be important to identify those direct grants of system privileges, you'll see why this is good to have. And we've also certified DBSAT for Autonomous Database, both Autonomous Transaction Processing and Autonomous Data Warehouse. We've included new language files as part of DBSAT 2.1, so it's no longer English only. It'll do sensitive data discovery in Portuguese, German, Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, and we're constantly hoping to add more languages to it. We've also revised how we report on sensitive data discovery. We've got a few new types in there. We've reorganized it into better subcategories, and we've also grouped the different data categories by risk level. And the sensitive data report also now includes some information on recommendations to secure different types and different levels of sensitive data. So a lot of new stuff in Database Security Assessment Tool. And again, you can look forward to seeing version 2.1 sometime within the next couple of weeks. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Rich. Again, one more quick reminder, please enter any questions you have about privilege analysis or anything related to database security in the chat window. Rich Evans is going to take us from here. Rich runs the outbound product management team for database security in North America. and he and I've been lucky to work with him for quite a while now, and happy to leave you in his capable hands. Rich?
Thanks, Russ. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We're going to talk about privilege analysis today. And my name is Richard Evans, and like Russ said, I'm the outbound product manager for database security products at Oracle. We're going to give you an overview and a demonstration of Oracle privilege analysis. First, a little housekeeping. We have our safe harbor statement here. We do not plan on discussing any new features or potential features on today's call, but we want to make sure that we always tell you that anything we discuss about features or timing is not set in stone until it's released. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about the big news about privilege analysis that Russ mentioned. We're going to give you a privilege analysis overview, the benefits of using it, and a live demonstration of it. And then at the end, we'll talk about any questions and answers you might have around privilege analysis. So like Russ said, the big news is that privilege analysis is now part of the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition license. This is back to the initial release of PA in Oracle 12c Release 1. The existing documentation will stay in the Database Vault documentation, but in Oracle Database 19c, it'll move to the Database Security Guide. So why did we move privilege analysis out of Database Vault? Well, this gives customers the ability to better assess their security posture. And we felt that least privilege and separation of duty go hand in hand. We want this to be something you use on a regular basis. We want to see you breaking roles down into separate roles, stop using default accounts, default users, and create custom roles and custom accounts for that exact purpose. So what does this mean for you? So this is a great way to identify those overprivileged application users, end users, or utility accounts. Those service accounts that may share privileges and perform multiple actions. Let's break those down into separate accounts and roles. And again, this is that tool that you can use to implement a least privilege model and enforce separation of duty. An overview of privilege analysis. This is a utility that's built into the database to capture privileges and roles used in the database. It has a minimal performance impact on the database because that processing is done during the report generation. Just think about it as it creating a check mark each time a privilege is used. When we generate that report, that's when we go and compare those privileges that they have and the privileges that they use to come up with the unused privileges. It has its own role as well. So if your user wants to execute, create, or generate reports around privilege analysis, you have to have a capture admin role. PA runs on an individual container database or at the pluggable database level. And it works without Database Vault configured or enabled. So it was an easy product to move out of the Database Vault licensing and into the Enterprise Edition licensing. Probably most importantly, Oracle's using privilege analysis to tune our privileges within our own applications. So the benefits of using privilege analysis, the first thing is we want to reduce the impact of compromised database accounts. The number one method that attackers use to get into your database, your network, or your operating system are compromised accounts. Those accounts oftentimes have too many privileges. Just over the years, they've collected them, and no one has gone back through and certified on what they really need. The other is to update existing roles and user privileges. Let's say before you release a custom application, which is going to be our demo today, you want to run privilege analysis to find out what you need. Before implementing a software update, let's identify any privileges that may have changed before we implement that update. If you're deploying a new vendor solution or testing it, a commercial off-the-shelf application, you can use privilege analysis. And again, instead of using these app owner accounts like apps in EBS or SAP R3 admin in SAP, we want to build role-specific accounts for separation of duty and to minimize those privileges, just in case those accounts become compromised or if they're tried to use for other purposes. Privilege analysis also gives you a method to attest which privileges are being used versus which ones are not. We've all probably gone through that paper exercise of providing our security team with a Excel spreadsheet of 10,000 privileges that an individual user has and saying, you asked for it, here it is, 10,000 privileges. But how do we know which of those they actually need, which are used or unused? And once we can decide which ones are used, then we can look at those unused privileges and decide if they're needed or not. And really, what we want for the database or any security environment is to work toward a least privilege model. Let's provide the least amount of privileges and the least privilege to perform the task. So how do we use privilege analysis? Well, first we have to define when to capture it. So there's 4 methods that we use here on how to define it. First, we can do it role-based. So let's say we want to look at an existing custom role that we've created, which we'll do in our demonstration today, and decide whether it needs those privileges or not. Or maybe we want to decide to create a new role based off of an existing role, break those privileges out. We can do it context-based, meaning we can look at the client's host name, IP address, username, module, or a custom identifier to know, to kick off privilege analysis. In our demonstration, we're going to do the last 2. We're going to do a role and context-based. We're going to look at a role and then our application owner username and look at how many privileges are there. Or we could do a database-wide unconditional. And an unconditional privilege analysis capture is going to get everything except sys. And we often get, well, why not sys? Well, for the same reason that you don't revoke privileges from root, right? Root is there for a specific purpose. Sys is there for a specific purpose. We want to stop using those accounts, the root account, the sys account, for day-to-day operations and have named accounts with custom roles that have those exact privileges that you need to perform that task. So to kick off and to monitor privilege analysis, we can use the GUI in Enterprise Manager 12c Release 3 or higher, or we can execute it via PLC SQL package, and we'll do both today. Some of the views that I want you to look for during the demonstration: DBA used privs, DBA unused privs, and DBA privs captures. DBA privs captures is where we'll see what privilege captures we have executed and whether they're currently enabled or not. And you'll also see that there's several other wildcarded views here, and they could be used or unused privileges. They could be object privileges, public privileges. So there's some views that break down these used and unused privileges into smaller chunks based on object, public, table, sys. Okay, so here's going to be our demo scenario. Our web-based HR application is about to go live with version 1.0. We want privilege analysis to identify unused privileges before the release day. To do this, we're going to perform the following steps. We're going to use our capture user to create and enable a database-wide privilege capture. We're going to kick this over to our quality assurance team, who are going to run a workload test. They're going to tell us when they're finished. Our capture user is going to generate that capture report. We're going to review the results, and then a little bit of foreshadowing. We're going to realize that we want to narrow it down a little further, and we're going to do it again, but we're going to narrow it down to the role in the context based on our user. So we'll have QA run another workload test. We'll have capture user generate the report again, and then we'll review the results. So during this process, you can think of this as maybe if you do sprints or build iterations, whatever your design is for building an application, you can incorporate privilege analysis into that process. So we'll switch over to my web browser here. I've got Enterprise Manager Cloud Control 13c, and I've got my HR application. I've also got SQL Developer, and I'm logged in as system, and I'm logged in as my capture admin. So the first thing I'm going to do is paste some SQL into SQL Developer, and we're going to verify that my capture user has the correct roles to perform a capture. So we're going to use the sysContext function, and we're going to look at sys session roles to see if this user has the capture admin role. He does, so we can continue. Then we want to look at the DBA priv captures view to see what privilege captures are already out there. We have one out there, or a dependency. He's a database-wide capture, and he is not enabled. Privilege analysis in database 12c release 2 captures additional privileges, and it captures it based on compiled objects. So your PL SQL packages, procedures, and functions. Privilege analysis can identify what dependencies those have to compile. Now what we want to do is we want to create our capture. So we're going to use our DBMS privilege capture package, execute the create capture procedure. We're going to give it a name of all database capture. We could include a description, but we don't need to. We'll just leave it blank. And then we're going to tell it what type of capture we want to perform. We're going to use the name here of G_database. There are 4 different options that we discussed earlier. We could do database, we could do role, context, or role and context. And all of these equate to a number. So in Enterprise Manager, when we run this later, you'll see that role and context is a 4. And it'll show a 4 instead of this G, role, and context. So let's create our capture. Our capture has been created. Now let's just verify that by looking at our view. There it is, all database capture. He's database wide, and he is not currently enabled. After we create the capture, we now need to enable it. We'll use the enable procedure. We'll provide it with our capture name, and then we'll also provide it with a run name. So if this is the first week in our sprint, we could name this sprint 1. And if we're asked to do this again the following sprint, we could name it sprint 2. I like to name it by dates so I can identify when I ran that privilege capture. But your naming choice is up to you. So let's go ahead and execute the enable capture. Now let's verify that our view has changed. Our DBA priv captures has gone from enabled no to enabled yes. So right now the database is sitting there and actively monitoring the privileges that are being used within the database. So now what we would do is we would turn this over to our QA team. We'd say, we're capturing the workload, go ahead and run your tests. So they'd come into the web interface probably. They'd had some testing here where they'd want to log in as a user, perform their web-driven testing where they check off if the search works, the new employees works, the drop-downs work, things like this. But then they'd also come over and they'd probably perform maybe some RESTful service testing or API testing. They do some additional testing. To kind of simulate that, what we'll do here is I'll paste a SQL script in SQL Developer and we'll run this script. So what we'll do is this script will connect as one of our database administrators. They'll perform some DBA type queries, looking at instances, processes, sessions, initialization parameters. We'll have another DBA connect and log in and check privileges. We'll have our application owner here, employee search, log in and perform some application queries, maybe create an index. And we'll have one of our power users here, power user Pete, log in and perform some queries that he would against the HR data. So one of the nice things about SQL Developer is it will connect to these users for you if you run this as a script. So if we choose the second button from the right here, run script or F5, SQL Developer will connect to those users using your connection string, execute the SQL, and then come back to system or whoever you're connected as. So our script is executed. We're not concerned about the results. What we're concerned about is that the objects were used, and we'll see what privileges were used to access those objects, okay? So at this point, the QA team would kick it back over to us and say, we've completed our regression testing. Go ahead and stop the capture, and let's generate the results. So I'll delete the existing SQL here. I'll paste my next SQL script, and we'll walk through it. Just to verify that our privileges capture is still running, we'll query the DBA priv captures view. All database capture is still enabled. Now we'll use the disable capture procedure to disable this specific database capture. We'll verify that he's been disabled. He has. Now we'll use the generate result procedure to generate the results. And this is where the work comes in for the database. So this will take just a moment in our environment. It may take longer if you've let this run for a week, 10 days, 14 days. It all depends on how much it has to process, how many objects were used, and then it has to go identify how many objects were not used that your users and your roles had access to. So ours is complete. And then we can take a look at this. So I'm going to paste some SQL over here for us to look at. And we're going to do this both in SQL Developer, and then we're going to do it in Enterprise Manager because it's a little easier on the eyes. So one of the first things I want to look at is just what runs and captures are out there. So I'll look at the view DBA used privs and DBA unused privs, join them together, and I can see all the captures and their associated runs. Let's say we fast forward to week 2 of our sprint, and I execute another capture for all database capture. I may name it run 2019-01-17 instead. And this would allow me to keep track of those runs between sprint 1 and sprint 2. So let's identify how many privileges were used by the capture and the run. So we'll create a little query here that groups those together. So we can see that the OR dependency had 617 privileges used. The all database capture for this run identified 182 privileges used. Well, what about unused privileges? Let's run that query. And all I did was change DBA used privs to DBA unused privs. Now it doesn't keep track of unused privileges for compiled objects because that would be everything, right? Everything that didn't use. So all it'll keep track of is for your database, your context, and your roles, okay? So here we can see that our all database capture for this specific run captured, oh wow, almost 150,000 unused privileges. Now, this is kind of a one-sided demonstration here. We only ran this for a minute, but you can imagine there's a lot of privileges out there that are probably granted to your application accounts, your service accounts, your DBA type accounts that just don't ever get used. So to make this a little easier, let's go into Enterprise Manager and see kind of the same thing. So I'm logged into my pluggable database. I'm going to click the security dropdown. I'm going to scroll down to privilege analysis. And this is going to prompt me to log in. I'm going to authenticate as the same user that I did in SQL Developer, capture user. He has that capture admin role. And then for him to log into Enterprise Manager, I also granted him that additional select catalog role so he can see that main screen. So when this loads, we're going to see that we have those same captures that we had in SQL Developer. We have the OR dependency. We have our all database capture. We can see when it was first started, last ended, the duration of the capture, how many users it captured, and then how many unused privileges it captured. Wow, that's quite a bit. So let's take a look at this 17 users. So there were 17 different users that were active during my capture. Capture user, that makes sense. I was using him. DBA Deborah and DBA Harvey, that makes sense. You saw that I generated some workload from those users. DBS and MP, yes. Enterprise Manager has started. I have an agent running. He's connected to my pluggable database. Employee search, that's the user that we're concerned about. That's our application owner. And a bunch of other sys-related schemas in here. My power user, XDB. There's a lot of things in here that is just a little overwhelming. I'm going to come in and look at the report and see just how many privileges we have in here. This report is going to show us a summary. It starts us off on the unused privileges report, and we can tab over to the used privileges. One of the things I want to show you is down here in this bottom right-hand corner, the row count matches the row count on that SQL Developer query that I executed just a moment ago. Almost 150,000 unused privileges in here. And some of these things like CDB replication process events, I'm not even familiar with what that is, but apparently our capture user has it. Okay, well, how did he get it? Oh, okay, he has that role, he has that privilege because of the select catalog role that he has. Okay, I may want to reduce that from him. DBA Harvey, he has some WM-sys privileges on version tables. Harvey also has that privilege because of the select catalog role. And I can just kind of keep scrolling through here and see all the system privileges that we have granted to these users that they're not using. And it would just keep going and going and going. And if I wanted to be mean, I could export this as a spreadsheet and I could hand this over to my security team or my audit team and say, here's all those privileges you asked for. But that doesn't do anything for us, right? And that doesn't help our project as we want to move this web-based HR application into production. What we're going to do instead is we're going to come back here in Enterprise Manager and we're going to target our HR application user employee search. And one of the things I know about it, because I was the DBA who was working on this project, let's say, is that we created a specific role for him called emp search app. And we want to see what privileges he's using from that or not. Let me just come back into reports and show that again, because I want to look at the used privileges here and see where he received some of those privileges. So he performed create session. Okay, he got that from a data pump export full database. DBA Deborah did. What about our user employee search? What did employee search get? And what did employee search use? It helps if you spell employee search correctly. 2 E's. Okay, so employee search used create session a couple times from the import full database, the connect, or from the employee search application role. Create any index was used from the employee search app role or from the import full database role. Well, I might ask myself or my fellow DBAs, well, why does employee search have import full database and export full database and some of these privileges? And you'll say, oh, that's right. In development, what we did was we granted them those privileges so they could perform their own export imports. They were working in multiple databases at the same time, working on different features, and they wanted to make sure that they were working from the same database data. So they passed around a copy of the master data and they needed export and import. Okay, well that makes sense in a non-production environment, but does it make sense when we move our application to version 1.0 in production? Probably not. So we saw those privileges. We saw a couple that employee search has, but what I really want to do is narrow this down for the next sprint. So we're going to create our capture through Enterprise Manager. We could do the same thing in SQL Developer like we did, but this time what we're going to do is we're going to change this scope from database wide to role and context. And this way we can identify those privileges that were granted to the role, emp search app, and only look at the conditions where we're looking for our specific user employee search. So what we'll do is we'll give this policy a name. We'll call it reduce employee search privileges. We already talked about our scope. We set it to role and context. We're going to scroll down to where we find emp search app. We'll select that as a role, and we're going to click the build content expression button here, and we're going to insert our syscontext expression. So we could use the policy builder here. I'm more comfortable doing it from here where I know what it looks like, where I can do my syscontext. I know I want it to be a user environment context, and I want to look for the session user where it equals employee search. So this is going to look and match anytime the employee search user logs into the database and has or uses the employee search app role. What I will do is just validate that my SQL is correct. I'm not missing any ticks, semicolons, backslashes, anything like that. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And the nice thing about Enterprise Manager is we can click Show SQL. We'll make this a little larger. And you'll see that it's performing the exact same commands that we did from SQL Developer. We're using the DBMS privilege capture package. We're running the create capture. We're giving it a name. We left the description null. Here's that type equals 4 that we discussed earlier. So this is that role and context capture. And when we use that type, we have to also include the roles that we want to include. So we've got our role name list of emp search app. We've got our condition of syscontext, where the session user is employee search. Okay, so now what we want to do is execute this. The other nice thing about doing this within Enterprise Manager is it can allow us to schedule these jobs too. Okay, so we created our application, our policy here for privilege analysis. Now we want to start our capture. So this is where we can schedule when we want this privilege analysis policy capture to begin. Let's say we know our sprint is going to start tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Let's schedule it for then. If we have offshore support and we know that they're going to start at 10 p.m., we could schedule it for then. We're just going to start it immediately. And then we're going to tell our QA team that they can go ahead and perform their next regression test. So we can see here that our policy is active. Our reduce employee search privileges is running. And we're going to have our team go through and do their testing once again. So they would come over to their user environment, their HR application. They would log in as their users. They would perform their standard testing that they would see on the website, right? Go through their normal regression tests, QA checks, security tests. And we're just going to do the same thing over here. We're going to run, let's say we just run a slightly different workload because we want to add some things to it. It's the next iteration of the sprint. They've added some new features. We're going to run this script again. So it'll connect as our employee search user. It'll connect as our power user Pete. It'll run these queries. QA comes back to the database team and says, we're done with our testing. We'll go back into Enterprise Manager. We will stop the capture. And again, like when we started the capture, we can choose whether we stop it immediately or we stop it later. So if we knew that we wanted to stop this test on this capture at 5 p.m. on Friday or 11:59 p.m., we could choose later and stop it then. We're going to choose immediate, and we're also going to click the button here that says generate report. So now remember, that's going to execute the disable capture procedure and then execute the generate report procedure. We'll click OK. And this could take a few minutes. It all depends on how long your privilege capture is running, how many privileges it's looking at. And we'll get our confirmation at the top of the Enterprise Manager page here that says capture for privilege analysis policy, reduce employee search privileges has been stopped, and Oracle Scheduler job has been submitted to generate the report. Okay, so we'll give it a second. We'll click refresh. And when it refreshes, we now have our reduce employee search privileges that shows a first start date, a last end time, a total capture duration. That was about a minute, I guess maybe a minute and a half, a little less than 2 minutes there. And it's targeted to one user. That user is our employee search user. You can see he still has a lot of unused privileges, whether they're system or object privileges, but he doesn't have 33,000. He doesn't have 146,000 unused privilege captures there. Let's take a look at what he has. So we're going to view reports again. We're on the unused privileges. We can scroll down here and we can see, wow, he has 13,000 privileges that he didn't use. How many privileges does this guy have? He has a lot. And we start to scroll through them. Okay, so wait, he has, what is this view? I'm not even sure if I should have access to this view, right? Oh, he has it because of a select catalog role. Oh, okay. Well, why did we give him select catalog role in the first place? You'll think back and it's, oh, the developers were doing some performance testing. They wanted access to some of these data dictionaries, some of the $V views. We allowed them to do some of this on their own, so we gave them some additional privileges. Okay, well, again, that's great in a non-production environment, but what about when we get to production? Do we want him to have all those privileges? Probably not, right? He also has import full database privileges still. Man, that's a lot of privileges. He has export full database privileges. Well, how many privileges exactly does this application have? Let's come back into SQL Developer, and we'll use system this time, since our system user can view all these queries. And we'll take a look at what privileges he has, right? So let's take a look at that role, that employee search user, employee search app role. And let's look at what roles were granted to that role. Oh, there's quite a few here. There's execute catalog role, select, full database export, a Java deploy. You say, no, that's right. We were going to write this in Java initially, so we went ahead and set him up to do Java. We don't even need to give him that. Let's just go ahead and take that away from him. So right away, we can identify some of these things, or we could revoke that Java deploy from our role. When we look at it again, export import on the database in production, I don't want my application account having those privileges. He doesn't need it. And we may know that as database administrators or security professionals, but privilege analysis provides us with that, that data that demonstrates that he did not ever use those privileges during that period of time. He may use one or two privileges from that, which we would want to include in the employee search app role, but he does not need access to all of the privileges that are available in export full, import full, select catalog, Java deploy, etc. Okay, so we want to slowly pull privileges off of his account. And already our employee search role has fewer privileges than he had before. And as we go through this development lifecycle, we can start to reduce this, reduce this, reduce this. There's probably some privileges in resource that he doesn't need. He may not be creating triggers. We may not want to grant him create trigger. So let's see what other privileges are granted to this role. We have create table. Well, that makes sense. Create any table. Oh, that might make sense if there was multiple schemas within our application. If we had employee search data, employee search reports, employee search data warehouse, etc., maybe we'd want them to create tables or other objects in each other's schemas. Create sequence, yeah. You've got this create database link privilege. Why does our user have that? Did we see him use that? Let's come back over to Enterprise Manager. Let's look at our used privileges, and we can see what he used here. Let's make this system privilege bigger. During our sprint, we saw him use create session, create index, create procedure, create table. We didn't see him use create database link. Why would he have that privilege? That would allow him to create links to other databases. And that might be great for an attacker or a curious or malicious user where they could compromise this account, get into the database, and potentially jump to other databases. But our employee search user, when he goes into production, he doesn't need this. And we start to ask why. It's, oh, the developers were using this to connect to other databases to build that master test data that they were using and then exporting. So they used it for that development process, but they don't need to use it in production. So we're going to go ahead and take that privilege away from our role. And we are already in even better shape than we were a few minutes ago, right? We reduced those system privileges, took one of those ones away. Any table privileges that were granted this role, we didn't see any being used. Are there? No, there aren't any. That's great. So there's nothing here we need to be concerned about. So just in the span of, we've been talking for 15 minutes, we've done a little example on how we can reduce these role privileges. if we did identify privileges that we want a user to have, maybe one of our power users needs to have privileges to select access or create a procedure or execute procedures, but our employee search user doesn't, we could look at how to divide that existing role into 2 roles or 3 roles. But really what we want to start with is just reducing those privileges, taking away what we see in the grant path of the full database, resource, what we see over here in the unused privileges for select catalog role, execute catalog role, Java deployments. So the more we can chip away, the better. Okay. So that's what I have for my demonstration. I think we covered everything here on our demo. We created the database-wide workload. We created that role and context, and we showed the difference between them. And already I'm feeling better about this application going live with version 1.0 than I did just 23 minutes ago. Okay, Russ.
Thanks, Rich. All right, everyone. One question: should privilege analysis be always enabled or only for a short period of time?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've looked at having it always enabled, but that's not currently capability within privilege analysis. So it is a begin capture, end capture, and generate that report. But you can have privilege, you could have it running virtually all the time if you scheduled it to, let's say, start at midnight and finish at 11:59, that next day. But it currently does not run nonstop.
Okay, thanks. Another question: how does privilege analysis relate to auditing?
Oh, that's a good question. So we feel they go hand in hand. So privilege analysis allows us to see what privileges were used or not used. But it allows us to do that just by basically checkboxing whether or not it was used. We can see some context around how it was used. We can see who the username was, what program or module they used to connect. But one of the nice things is it just tells us whether it was used once or not, right? Where auditing, if we wanted to audit access to an object, we would have to audit select. Well, that object may get selected 10,000 times an hour, and we don't want to audit all that information, right? We just want to know, basically, yes or no, is that object used or not? So let's say we identify some objects that are not being used. We could create a unified audit policy to audit those unused objects for when they do get used. So we may have some critical tables there that we're not seeing any queries from over a period of 2 weeks that we're running a capture. And rather than starting it again, maybe we want to create an audit trail or a unified audit policy and audit select on those objects and see full context about when, where, and how those objects are accessed.
All right. Thanks, Rich. We've got several people who complimented you on the presentation and the demo. They general consensus it was good. I want to remind everyone on the call, this is open Q&A, so you're not limited to privilege analysis, but please either ask in chat or feel free to unmute and ask by voice. Rich, are you looking at chat?
Yeah.
Do you see this question?
Do. So the principle of PA is there's first too many privileges, and then some of them should probably be revoked to build up a set of minimal privileges necessary for executing a given workload. Yeah, so that's what we would encourage you to do in a development environment with privilege analysis. And you don't even have to tell your developers you're doing it, right? So maybe we don't do it in a development environment, maybe we do it in the pre-prod environment or the staging environment where we can have a little more realistic workload, but database administrators can run this and capture those privileges that are being used. And you could run it for a week, you could run it for 2 weeks, you could create multiple runs if you wanted to do it that way and just kind of build that up. But so I think you could do all that with privilege analysis. I think we've tried to reduce some of the privileges that we've given to Connect to the resource role. So Oracle's got some built-in roles that we've reduced the privileges on, but we always encourage you, customers, to create custom roles and to kind of identify those minimal privileges for your application or within your corporation.
Thanks, Rich. I also think this is sort of the scenario that you went through in your demo, because you were talking about a case where you've got an application account, that employee search account.
Yeah.
And it had broad privileges at the beginning. And then as you were going through the development process, you'd mentioned sprint 1, sprint 2, you began to trim those down and to identify only the privileges that were needed. And then from there, converting it to a least privilege account was fairly simple.
Mm-hmm.
Did we answer that question for you properly, or?
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to have it where maybe it kind of flagged that, some kind of like autonomous privilege analysis, where we could show the user, kind of automatically, these were the privileges that we used. We've been tossing around this idea internally on how we could do something like that. It kind of crosses over into auditing. And so we're trying to maintain a solid line between what privilege analysis does and what auditing does. But I do think that, yeah, it would be nice to be able to build up a set of minimal privileges more autonomously than we do today. But we've tried to make privilege analysis really easy to use. It can be combined with that DBMS scheduler. You can do it through Enterprise Manager. You can do it through SQL Developer or Toad or SQL Plus. So hopefully most DBAs will find it easy to just script it and, oh yeah, we want to start a capture, and they create a SQL script or a shell script, a bash shell script that runs this for them when they start a sprint. Russ, one of the things I did not mention, but that was brought up, was about auditing. I think we're going to do a office hours on the Unified Audit Trail sometime early this year, aren't we?
That's the hope. The topic for next month is planned to be Key Vault,
okay,
depending on a release schedule. But if Key Vault slips, then we'll do unified auditing. And if Key Vault does ship next month, then we'll do unified auditing probably in March.
Okay. And then that question just came in, talking about unified auditing.
Oh, yes, that's our plan. It's in our build. The challenge with this is we only do one a month. Well, and we skip 2 months in the year, so we only do 10 a year. So that one's high in our queue, the unified auditing one. It's a really interesting topic. I don't know how much you've played around with unified auditing, but there's so much you can do, especially with conditional auditing, that I think we can easily get a couple of hours out of that.
Agreed.
Oh, speaking of which, we should have said this earlier. We got our notification for Collaborate, the International Oracle Users Group Conference this year. And one of the topics that we submitted for Collaborate was unified auditing, and that session was accepted. So Rich and I will be presenting on unified auditing at Collaborate this year. And
that's right here in San Antonio, Texas, where I live.
In April, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And that'll be a nice time to be in San Antonio. It won't be too hot. Yeah, it's downtown too. It'd be beautiful. I'd recommend anyone who can attend, spend a couple days down on the Riverwalk.
We're still waiting to find out if they picked up our hands-on lab on unified auditing. They haven't told us which labs got accepted yet. But
okay. Oh, that'd be fun.
that will. Okay, guys, got about 5 minutes left. I'll keep the phone lines open, but again, if you're not interested in questions or the Rich and Rush show this morning, then we'll see you next month. And really hoping our topic's going to be Key Vault, but our fallback is unified auditing. Just monitor the AskTOM website for details, and I'll update those as we get closer. Rich, Pat's got a question on privilege analysis and attempts to use privileges that haven't been actually granted, so failed attempts to use privileges.
Oh, failed attempts. No, it doesn't capture those. It's either used or unused.
Might be an interesting enhancement, though.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's kind of like almost like a training mode or a simulation mode in database Vault.
Yeah.
So this is that scenario where your developers say, well, I need DBA. Okay, you can have DBA in non-production, or maybe a subset of DBA, and let them go wild and then capture what privileges they used. And you can eyeball them and kind of say, yeah, you're not going to use that one again. Or you could use unified audit and enable auditing on some of those objects to see maybe how many times they use them, where they use them from, and what SQL statement they use with those privileges to access those objects. Yeah, but there's nothing directly in privilege analysis that'll give us that not granted privileges.
Question from Jim about setting up enterprise user security for account management with a large number of users, and is it best to use shared or dedicated schemas? And then it seems with shared, it's one shared on a database and you can't control the amount of sessions. In the first place, I almost always use shared if I can, because that's less work for me and I'm fundamentally lazy, Jim. So shared if I can get there. And the thing that'll force me to use dedicated is if the end user needs private schema objects. If they need private schema objects, then of course they have to have a dedicated schema. For shared, you aren't limited to one on a database. You can have really as many as you want on a database. You just have to ensure that the users mapped to the shared schema don't intersect. If you're doing this with EUS, then shared schema is either based on directory subtree mapping or upon entity mapping, where you explicitly assign people to the shared schema. So you couldn't have two different parts of two different shared schemas mapped to the same subtree. They would have to be different parts in the subtree. If you look at the new centrally managed users, we've made that a whole lot easier to work with by switching to a group-based paradigm for shared schemas. And each shared schema can map to a different group. And as long as the same user isn't in both groups, then it'll be fine. For control of sessions, you're correct. If you're using max number of sessions based upon password profile, or if you're using something in SQLnet.Aura parameters, those will apply to the entire session, not just to the one end user.
Now, Jim, would you say you're primarily on 12C release 2? Or are you on 12.1 in a lot of places? Okay, 11G, yeah. 11G, hopefully 11.204, that terminal release, fully patched, right? Okay.
I don't know, at this point, I'd skip 12.2 and just go to 19.
Yeah, Russ, I was going to ask, do we have an upgrade path from 11.204 to 19?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, under the covers, 19 is, if we hadn't changed numbering schemes, 19 would have been 12.3.
Okay. 12.2?
Or 12.4?
or 12.204 or?
No, it would have been 12.3.
Waiting for those on-prem releases. Okay.
Yeah, I'm with Pat on this one. If I was on 12.1, I would just go straight to 19C. And Jim, one good thing, I don't know if you caught it, is if you looked at 18C, there was almost a 6-month gap between when we released it in the cloud and we got to on-premises. For 19C, unless we run into showstoppers, which could always happen, we expect to have the on-premises release out just 2 or 3 months after the cloud release. So if everything goes according to schedule, you'll see 19C on-premises before summer.
Sounds like a good summer project, Russ.
It does. All right, we are coming up to the very top of the hour. Guys, I want to thank you again for spending some time with us today. We look forward to seeing you next month. Don't forget, email channel's always open. And if you do go to the AskTOM website, we've had a couple of people that have posted questions on the website, but they posted them without giving an email address. And we have no way to know who posted the question. Even if you were logged in with your Oracle account, the AskTOM website doesn't capture that. So let us, make sure to put your email address in so we can see that in the question. Other than that, feel free just to send it to me or to Rich if you'd like.